Welcome to Week 5 Project Planning. Please read Chapter 10 in the Verzoo book and selected readings in the PMGT. In the Canvas Learning Management System, we are on Module 5, where you'll find the usual overview, agenda, assignments, and lectures for this week. Your assignments include the normal readings, discussions, quiz, and your next course project deliverables. Due this week is your project schedule. Examples of a project schedule can be found in the Verzoo Chapter 10, and I have included a project schedule template in the file sections under templates and forms. Last week, the focus was on the what, the scope of the project, breaking down the scope into deliverables, sub-deliverables, and work packages using the work breakdown structure technique. We continued planning this week and focus on building the project schedule. The project schedule focuses on the when, the timeline. A project schedule indicates what needs to be done, which resources will be utilized, and when the project is due. It's a timetable that outlines start and end dates, milestones that must be met for the project to be completed on time. The project schedule is often used in conjunction with a work breakdown structure to distribute work among team members. The project schedule should be updated regularly to gain a better understanding of the project's status. In the Verzoo textbook, you'll find project planning steps. He starts with the pre-planning steps on page 189, which includes the project definition that we did back in week 2 of the class. You'll recall we did a business case, stakeholder register, and assumption log for our course project. In week 3, we did the risk management plan, where we created a risk register along with any other RAID logs. In week 4, we completed the WBS. If your WBS is already task-oriented, you can move on to the next step. If not, if you have a deliverable-oriented WBS, you'll need to define activities and tasks before you can move on to Step 2. Step 2, as you see here, is the identification of the task activities relationships. Basically, the successors, then the predecessors. In what sequence will your task take place? Number 3 is estimating work packages, and we'll touch very lightly on that this week because we will be covering estimating next week. Number 4 is calculating and building the initial schedule. Now, Verzoo goes through a more complicated technique of forward passes and backwards passes to calculate the critical path. We will not be doing that as part of this class, but it's nice for you to read about it and have it for a future, more advanced class. And then number 5 is assign and level the resources. Basically, we don't want anybody working over or under 40 hours. We want to get the most efficient use of our resources. So diving into each one of these steps a little bit further, Step 2, identifying task relationships, is where we would first have to create the detailed task if we have not already done that. Please remember that the PMGT does not use the word task, but instead uses the word activities. I will use the words task and activities interchangeably in this class. Next, we want to sequence our tasks and activities in the order that they need to be complete. While we're doing the sequencing, we have to create the relationships so that we know the predecessors and the successors. You'll find relationship rules that apply when you're doing this step. We want to define task relationships only between work packages. Many people have got into the very bad habit of creating relationships between summary tasks and milestones, and that's a big no-no. Another rule is task relationships should only reflect sequence constraints between work packages, not resource constraints. Let me read that again. Task relationships should reflect only sequence constraints between work packages, not resource constraints. Resource constraints is another problem and should not be considered when you're building your schedule. You can see an example of a simple network diagram on page 192, and for very small projects, a network diagram would help in the sequencing exercise. Verzoo also covers milestones, which are significant events in a project. These are an anchor for which we can add to our schedule, basically a point in time. Milestones do not have duration, nor do they have work effort. Verzoo's next step, step 3, is estimate work packages. Again, we'll be covering this next week, so just read the information that's in the Verzoo Chapter 10 and focus on primarily the duration estimate for this week. Know the difference between a work estimate and a duration estimate. A work estimate is the amount of hours, time that it takes to complete the task. The duration is calendar time. For example, it may only take you 2 hours to pour a concrete pad. However, it could take up to 4 or 5 days for that pad to dry before you could build upon it. So the work effort would be the 4 hours, but the duration would be 5 days. One technique that we will use as part of estimating work packages is something known as the bottom-up estimating technique. Here we'll want to make sure that we include labor, equipment, materials, and we want to consider the skill level, or another way to say that is the productivity of the people that will be doing the work. Again, we will get into greater detail on estimating next week. Step 4, according to Verzoo, is calculating the initial schedule. You're not really doing calculation here, but you are doing something that is more art than science. So 90% of what you'll do in calculating the initial schedule comes from your past experiences. And you'll iterate your schedule over and over again over time. For this class, we will not be covering the critical path or the forward pass, backwards pass, or float. But again, I encourage you to read through that for future use. We will also not require you to create a Gantt chart or a time-scaled network diagram for your course project, but it is optional. The fifth and final step, according to Verzoo, is to assign and level resources. Here, we want to make sure that we optimize the use of people and equipment. We want to be able to use the fewest possible resources. So we use a technique known as resource leveling, where we need to know the initial schedule to start, and then we smooth out the peaks and valleys so that, again, nobody is having or required to work over 40 hours or is being underutilized by working less than 40 hours. Now we can apply our realistic schedule test, also known as a sniff test. Does our schedule make sense? One way to figure that out is to do a schedule review with your project team, with your sponsor. Eventually, your sponsor will approve your schedule and you will have a baseline schedule. So this week we covered several exciting project schedule features. We saw the network diagram on page 192 of the Verzoo book. This is a diagram that helps you sequence the activities or tasks in the correct order and shows you relationships between the activities. On page 210, you got to see a Gantt chart. This is a nice visual representation of when work is occurring. Gantt charts are really useful when you're presenting information to your leadership. On page 14 is an example showing tasks and activities on a project schedule, something that you will be doing this week for your course project. On page 192, they talk about milestones, which I talked about earlier as well. These are significant events in time that you want to point out on your project schedule. There was a question last week about summary tasks, and there's examples of summary tasks on page 218 of the Verzoo book. On page 194, Verzoo gets into more details on the three most popular relationships: finish start, start start, and finish finish. So in closing, as usual, I encourage you to participate in the discussion board at least 4 times, responding to me and your peers, and don't forget to include your takeaway item each week. Read the responses from your peers and keep the conversation going all week. Watch for announcements, make sure that you complete your quiz on time, and you submit your course project deliverable on time. Know that you can contact me anytime via email or text, and I will respond as soon as possible. Again, thank you for being part of this class, and I hope you have a great week.